Well, that's really up to us. The masters of the universe, as they call themselves, are busily at work right now, as they always are, to try to ensure that the outcome of the crisis will be in their benefit, even more harshly in their benefit. And the question is whether other forces can mobilize to counter and overwhelm them. So, for example, right now, if you take a look at the huge stimulus program that the Trump administration came out with, the biggest in human history, in U.S. history, maybe human history. It has some good aspects, but overwhelmingly, it's being directed to the needs of the corporate sector, the finance, and so on. They're, you know, eating at the trough the way pigs do. And if it continues that way, it offers essentially nothing to the people who are the worst victims. And I can go through this in detail. But yes, that's what's happening. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel industries, who are intent on making as much profit as they can before they destroy the world, not in the distant future, they're appealing for more funding, more deregulation, and of course being offered it by the criminal Trump administration. So that's the kind of thing that's happening before our eyes. We can either counter it or allow it to come. Could be a much better world. This is a good opportunity for people to think of what kind of world we want. Do we want to go back to the tragic history of recent years, or do we want to overcome it? And there are many ways to do it, different in different countries. Problems in the US are very different from the problems in Egypt. But in each place, there are ways to try to overcome the tragedies and criminality of the past. But it's not enough to know that it's possible. It's necessary to pick up the ball and run with it. Well, the U.S. actually followed its usual policy when some favored dictator is in trouble, case after case. Somoza, Marcos, Duvalier, many others. The pattern is to support him as long as it's possible. When it becomes impossible, maybe the military turns against him, the business classes turn against him. And then what you do is claim that you were always opposed to him, send him off somewhere, island in the Red Sea in this case, and try to reconstitute the same system as best you can. So that was what was tried. There were very serious problems internal to Egypt, which you can't attribute to the United States, and it ended up with a vicious dictatorship, maybe the worst in Egypt's history, which the U.S. strongly supports and the business world strongly supports. They flock to Egypt for economic conferences to see what they can gain from robbing the people of Egypt at a desperate point. But that's what you expect. The question is whether there will be means to counter it. And there can be in the United States and in Egypt. It's very hard to find a coherent strategy in the chaos of the Trump White House, but you can detect something. The thing that comes out clearest is the effort to construct an international of the most reactionary states and use it to be the base for the next phase of U.S. imperial interests. So it's in the Middle East. It means Sisi's Egypt, the Gulf family dictatorships, Israel is right at the center of it, they're all now cooperating almost openly, moving a little beyond to Modi's India, vicious Hindu dictatorship, racist dictatorship, which is trying to destroy the huge Muslim community and dismantle Indian secular democracy, moving on to Europe, countries like Hungary's Orban, which is verging on fascism, Salvini in Italy, who's reconstructing something like Italian fascism. In Latin America, the prize example is Brazil's Bolsonaro, who's actually competing with Trump to see who can be the most evil figure in the modern world. And if you can meld all of these together, you have a reactionary international which can serve as the base for extending, maintaining US power. There are particular enemies. The main enemy is Iran. The reason Iran is an enemy is well explained by US intelligence in their briefings to Congress. The problem is that they point out that Iran has very low military expenditures, even by the standards of the region, let alone the United States. Its strategic policy is deterrent. I want to try to deter an invasion long enough for diplomacy to enter. They say if they are thinking of developing nuclear weapons, which they may or may not be, that would be part of their deterrent strategy. Now, who is it who's opposed to a deterrent strategy? Well, rogue states, countries that want to be able to use force freely without any impediment. And there are two of them, Israel and the United States. So naturally, they can't tolerate a deterrent. Incidentally, it's worth remembering, in the US, you just can't talk about this. Maybe in Egypt you can. There's a very simple solution to any potential threat that anyone thinks Iran might pose with its weapons programs. Very simple. Actually, the answer was presented forcefully by Egypt 30 years ago. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region with tight enforcement, which we know can be done. It's just been done, in fact, in the case of the joint agreement, the recent agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons, which Trump tore up, was working very well, intensively monitored. U.S. intelligence, International Atomic Agency recognizes that Iran lived up to it. So that's not a problem. So establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Egypt has actually been in the forefront of pressing for this since the 90s. Comes up every 5 years at the nuclear review meetings. Every time it's vetoed by the United States. Nobody else is opposed. Iran is strongly in favor. The Arab states are in favor, led by Egypt. The non-aligned countries, 130 countries, strongly in favor. U.S. vetoes it. Why? The last one was Obama, incidentally, 2015. The answer is known to everybody. The U.S. does not want Israel's nuclear weapons system to be inspected. In fact, the U.S. does not even admit that it exists. The U.S. says it doesn't know whether it exists, which, of course, total nonsense, obviously, And there's a reason for that. If the U.S. conceded that Israel has nuclear weapons, U.S. laws would begin to be invoked, and U.S. aid to Israel would have to be canceled. Not allowed to give aid to countries that develop nuclear weapons outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So in order to protect Israel from inspection, the U.S. is willing to face serious dangers of major war breaking out, maybe just by accident, in its conflict with Iran. It tells you something very important. also helps explain why this can't be discussed in the United States. You take a look to a Google search, try the New York Times search index, can't mention it. It's perfectly obvious, it's right in front of everyone's eyes. As I said, Egypt is in the forefront of pressing for this, has been for almost 30 years, but you can't talk about it. Well, that's the reactionary international has to be aimed against Iran. In fact, the way there's plenty wrong with Iran. We could spend a whole session on the rottenness of the government, but that's not the point. At this point, Iran is suffering very severely from the virus, and the United States is consciously, openly trying to rapidly and massively increase the crisis, kill as many Iranians as possible by tightening the sanctions regime. Sanctions regime is illegitimate to begin with. The US is the only country in the world that can impose sanctions, has about probably 30% of the world's population under sanctions. And US sanctions are third country sanctions. Other countries have to observe them, even if they don't like them. So Europe strongly opposes the sanctions on Iran, which are now being used, extended, in fact, to increase the torture at a time of need. They oppose it, but they can't do anything about it. Because you oppose US sanctions, US power throws you out of the international financial system. Okay, so you have to follow the master. None of this is acceptable. Cuba has been under murderous US sanctions ever since it achieved independence, not because of anything it does, only because of, as internal documents in the US concede, because of what's called its successful defiance of the United States. And you can't do that. The world is run like the mafia. And if you defy the Godfather, you're going to be punished. Okay? That's the way much of the world runs. Israel is called the one democracy in the Middle East, but that's deeply flawed. I don't have to go into the details. For half the population that Israel rules, it's not just lack of democracy, it's virtually living in a prison. Even within Israel proper, there's extreme discrimination. But going to the Arab world, there actually has been one free election in the Arab world. It was in January 2006 in Palestine. First free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be fair and free. What was the result? The result was that the United States instantly began to organize a military coup to overthrow the elected government. Israel increased its terrorist activities against Gaza, imposed harsh sanctions. The European Union, to its shame, went along. The problem was that the wrong people won. And an election is only fair and acceptable if your candidates win, from the point of view of the powerful. Wrong candidates win, you destroy it. So that's the one free election. Lebanon has semi-free elections. The confessional system that was left by French imperialism strongly impedes the growth of genuine democracy. Elsewhere, you find bits and pieces, limited forms in Kuwait, nothing much. It's mostly dictatorships. The Arab Spring was going to break with that. No, I don't think the Arab Spring is dead. I think it was beaten back, but the forces are still there. I suspect they'll rise again. It's a long process. The person who's maybe described this best, as far as I know, is Gil Ashkar, Lebanese origin. He teaches at the School of Oriental African Studies in London, who's right away at the time of the Arab Spring said this is a very important step, but only the first step to a long process of breaking down autocratic institutions, culture of subservience. Many steps have to be taken, but they can be taken. It won't win in a minute, but it can over time. And the recent uprisings in Egypt are another indication of it. Labor activism is another indication. Tunisia has somewhat escaped the repression, but I think there are enough. You can even see it in the family dictatorships, like in Saudi Arabia. The younger people are pressing for an end to the worst imposed discipline of the, Wahhabi clerical leadership, and they're making some inroads. So it's a process which could go on. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of time unless serious steps are taken to reverse the growing environmental crisis. Most of the regions are going to be unlivable, literally. You won't be able to survive, so it won't matter. Same with South Asia. There are really desperate problems that have to be dealt with, and there isn't much time left. Aramco can't continue poisoning the environment. If it does, there won't be any Aramco. You won't be able to live there. These threats are much deeper than the coronavirus threat, which is bad enough. And I should say, I don't think we've come anywhere near seeing the severity of that. It hasn't yet hit the poor countries of the world, where it's going to be a disaster. I mean, in the deeply impoverished slums of Egypt, say, you're not going to be able to wash your hands every 15 minutes or sequester yourself isolated from others. And that's duplicated all over the world. That's going to be an utter catastrophe. And what's happening shows a degree of sadism that's difficult to describe. So there's, for example, a shortage everywhere of ventilators. All the countries are trying to get some share of them. They can't. The poorer countries, even relatively rich countries like Brazil, can't get them because they're being outspent by the rich countries who want to take them all for themselves. If hundreds of millions of people die elsewhere, it's none of our problem. I mean, this sadistic, anti-human behavior in a competitive environment shows you that, we're living in a really sick world. It's even narrower. I mean, take, say, the European Union. It's called a union. They're showing how much of a union it is. The rich countries like Germany have the virus pretty much under control. Right next to them, a couple miles away, the epidemic is raging. Does Germany help? No, not our business. Not only does Germany not help, it's blocking the effort to create Eurobonds, which could be a basis for helping the poorer countries. No, we just are in it for ourselves. If a couple of miles across the border and people are dying, not our problem. Fortunately, the ones who are suffering in northern Italy can turn across the Atlantic for help from Cuba. Cuba is showing the one example of genuine internationalism, sending doctors aided by medical supplies from China to the most areas that are suffering the worst. That's been going on for many years. Cuba was largely responsible for the liberation of Africa, and Black Africans know it. When Mandela was released from prison, the first thing he did was praise Castro for his contributions to the liberation of Africa, beating back South African forces in Angola, laying the basis for the freedom of Namibia, undermining apartheid in South Africa. Internationalism and selfless internationalism costs them a lot. They don't get anything from it. When there's a terrible earthquake in Pakistan and villages are destroyed and people are dying, Cuban doctors go. When the coronavirus is devastating Italy, Cuban doctors go. So genuine internationalism is not impossible, but it's necessary to rise to the level of civilization and culture of the countries that do it. Meanwhile, right next door to Cuba, Trump canceled all aid to Palestinians, all, through UNRWA, Palestinian hospitals, and he explained his reasons. They're not respectful enough of me. Okay? If you shine my shoes, maybe I'll give you some pennies. But if you're not respectful enough, I'll strangle you. That's right next door to Cuba. Now, there's a little difference in the power of Cuba and the United States. I don't have to go into that. And as I mentioned before, Cuba's been under harsh U.S. sanctions ever since it gained independence. Well, the interesting thing about the Kushner-Netanyahu deal of the century, Netanyahu is basically the author. He handed it to this little boy who's Trump's servant to make it look at what's coming from the United States. The interesting question about this is why anybody is paying the slightest attention to it. Suppose that this proposal had come from China or Germany or any other country in the world. You wouldn't even bother to laugh at it. I mean, it's ludicrous. Why even look at it? Well, that's a sign of U.S. power. When it comes from U.S. power, no matter how ridiculous and grotesque it is, that becomes the central issue. So you read the sober discussions in the newspaper. It's, will it work? Is it fair? Is it going to have this defect or other? The proper reaction was to laugh and throw it aside. It's not even worth laughing about. If you want to know what kind of deal it is, just look at the right wing of the Israeli Foreign Office and what they come out with. That's the deal of the century. We don't have to go through the details. See? And to its credit, it actually sort of formalizes what has been U.S. policy anyway. So if you look back at U.S. policy over the last 50 years or so, it's been basic. I mean, Israel's had a very definite policy, clear policy, to create a kind of greater Israel, which will incorporate every part of the occupied territories that's of value to Israel, connect it to Israel with vast infrastructure projects, leave aside the areas of heavy Palestinian population concentration. So Israel doesn't want Nablus. You have to maintain what's called a democratic Jewish state, meaning not too many Arabs. So the Palestinian population is left out, but everything else is taken. And the remaining Palestinian population is divided into literally hundreds of enclaves, small enclaves, virtually unlivable people, farmers separated from their fields, checkpoints all over, impossible existence. Hope is maybe somehow they'll leave. That's has been the policy of every Israeli administration, including the so-called doves like Shimon Peres, who was the one who advanced the settlement deeply into the West Bank, what Israel calls Judea and Samaria. Well, the U.S. has sort of sat by and funded this. Every once in a while they say, we don't like it, please don't do it, but then fund it. Okay, now it's out in the open. That's our policy. So to Trump's credit, he brought out the policy in its sheer ugliness and sadism, which fits his character and view of the world. So now it's there for everyone to see. But aside from that, the deal of the century doesn't even merit a moment's comment and attention. China is a growing society, but it's a poor country. It's not like the United States. You take a look, say, at the UN Human Development Index. It's about the best measure we have of the health of a society. China ranks around 90th. India around 130th. I mean, all this talk about China and India taking over the world is sheer paranoia. Take a look at which countries can impose sanctions. One, the United States. Which country has almost 1,000 military bases all over the world? The United States. Which country practically outspends the rest of the world, comes close to it in just military spending? The United States. Which country has extraordinary advantages that no other country begins to share? Huge territory, enormous resources, homogeneous population. Once they exterminated the native population, it was free for Europeans to take over. The economy for a century was based on slavery, which created the worst system of slavery in history, created the basis for the modern economy. Remember that cotton was the oil of the world up until the late 19th century. Britain prospered from this, the United States, others. Finally, right now, there's no other country that begins to have the advantages of the United States. I mean, it happens to have to be a highly business-run society to an extraordinary extent. So that has its impact on the nature of the society. So if you look at OECD, the rich countries' measures of social justice, the United States ranks practically at the bottom, next to Mexico and Greece. You look at the health system. One of the problems now, the U.S. health system is a disaster. It's twice the per capita cost of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. Right now, it's suffering severely because under the neoliberal regime, it's been following a business model. Business model means no spare capacity. You don't want to waste money on having an extra bed in case something goes wrong. So the business model of what's called efficiency, no spare capacity, just enough to get by in normal circumstances. And that's not so great, as plenty of people, including me, can tell from personal experience, but at least it kind of works. If anything out of the range of normal happens, you're out of luck. In fact, if you look more closely at what's been happening, it's almost mind-boggling. So take ventilators, which are right now the bottleneck of the system. I mean, doctors and nurses have to make agonizing decisions as to who to kill today because there aren't enough ventilators to go around. Why? Well, there's a long history, but let's just take Trump. In January, it was well known worldwide that there's a major serious epidemic, maybe pandemic coming. So what did the Trump administration do? It was shipping ventilators and other masks and other equipment out of the United States to China and other countries. That went on until March, when finally Trump recognized, look, this is no joke. So they started importing the same ventilators and masks from China. And for the manufacturers and the middlemen, the shipping industries, it's wonderful. They made money sending them out, making money bringing them in. Now, this is the kind of thing that goes on. It's, in fact, if you want to really see a clear case, clear illustration of the mentality in Washington, take a look at the budget that came out for the next year, budget proposal, in mid-February, when the epidemic was raging, no questions about it. Mid-February, Trump comes out with his budget, it calls for continued defunding of the Center for Disease Control and every health-related component of the government. So keep defunding them, as Trump had been doing all through his term, right in the midst of the pandemic. But other things have to get funded, like huge subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. That's the budget. And of course, the military. That tells you just what the mentality is of this criminal gang in the most powerful state in world history. Okay? Naturally, people are afraid of it. In fact, the United States around the world is feared and hated to an astonishing extent. You can see it just reading the Arab press. You do it much more than I do, but just my little reading of the translations, it's unbelievable. In fact, I'll give you a personal anecdote that illustrates it. There's an internet scam going around, some lunatic article claiming the United States started the coronavirus in order to kill people in the world and take it over. It's attributed to me. Totally false, of course. I'm getting letters from all over the world, including friends, including colleagues, serious people, saying, thank you for finally telling the truth. I mean, hatred of the United States is so extreme that people believe anything. But the power, you have to bow down before. It's strong, can't do anything about it. Until in the United States, its own population manages to dissolve it and turn it into a more free society. The young people who worked hard for Sanders feel very depressed and think it was a failure, but they're mistaken. That's part of another odd fact of the United States. There's no history. There's no historical continuity. There are no movements that continue and go back for a long time. Every movement is started from zero, mostly young people, so they know nothing about what happened before. You take any serious social movement, abolitionism, women's rights, Arab Spring, anyone, they go forward. They suffer setbacks, but they don't quit. They don't give up the first time you have a setback. You go on. Now, in fact, Sanders's campaign was an enormous success, a lasting success. He changed completely the arena of discussion and even policy formation in the United States. Crucial things that were regarded as ridiculous a couple of years ago are now in the center of attention. Universal health care, free higher education, workers' rights, decent wages. It's all in the center of attention, mainly because of him. That's a tremendous success. He also did something else. He showed you can run a political campaign successfully without relying on private wealth and corporate power. That's a break with a century of U.S. political history. These are great successes. You can build from them. You don't have to go home and cry, you know. And I think much of the same is true of the Arab Spring. It achieved a great deal, brought people to understand, yes, there are things we can do. So let's do it despite the harshness of the dictatorship, and much worse than anyone faces in the United States, of course. Well, Sanders made it clear, he was in his withdrawal speech, that the movement is not ending. The campaign is ending because of many circumstances, but the movement is going on. And it's up to mostly young people to put some flesh on those words, to make them real. Can be done. If it's done, it could be a much better world. But I'm afraid I have to go off. I have another interview coming in a minute.